All right. And today we have with us Jessica Kenealy. She's an assistant professor at Eastern Kentucky University, teaching in their animal and veterinary science program. Before working here, she achieved her doctorate in veterinary sciences with a focus on equine parasitology at the University of Kentucky. Growing up, Jessica was a longtime member of her local 4-H horse and pony club. Since then, she's had a love for working with 4-Hers and supporting their organizations. Ultimately, 4-H started Jessica's dream of pursuing an education and career in the animal and equine science industry. Jessica and her husband have been married for 6 years, and since then, they have acquired several 2-legged and 4-legged children, including 2 daughters, Josephine and Juliana, ages 4 and 2, 2 dogs, a cat, and Jessica's beloved horse, Apollo. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Kenealy. If you all have any questions or need anything, just type in the chat box. I'll be monitoring that. And here we go. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, Mary Jane, and welcome everyone. I'm so excited that you're joining and I get the opportunity to talk about one of my favorite topics in the world, parasites, particularly those belonging to horses. I'm very used to doing Zoom lectures of teaching through COVID for the last 2 years. So if you want to jump in and ask questions, feel free. I don't mind. If you want to type something in the chat box, I'll be watching that as well as Mary Jane, and I'll try to answer those as I go as well. So don't feel like you have to wait if you really want to know something. So I'm going to kind of start with just a little overview just to kind of give you an idea of where I'm going with this topic. Parasites are a huge topic, and so it was a little bit challenging for me to distill it down. So this is kind of where I'm trying to take the focus for you all. We'll start with just a basic introduction of what is a parasite. I know everyone's got a little bit of a different background and knowledge of horses and animals, so we'll kind of just start there, and then we'll talk about those that are really important to horses or equines. And then as far as what you should do or how you should feel about parasites in your horse, and then how to manage those worms in a responsible way. So that's kind of our outline for this. So we'll begin. Okay, what is a parasite? So go ahead and give me something in the chat box, just your basic definition. What do you think a parasite is? It can be very broad. Worms, good. Annie, thank you. Yes, worms is definitely right. Does anyone else have any kind of something that is hard to get rid of? Yes, that can be very true as well. Okay, good. I like the participation here. Yep, worms are certainly a parasite. Something in the eye, we do have eye parasites as well. Mites, yes. Okay, so good. A parasite, by definition, okay, is a living thing that lives in or on another living thing. That other living thing is called a host. So by definition, you can have a parasite within a parasite, okay? So that's kind of the whole conundrum in itself. But the host is required for the parasite's survival. So we tend to think of parasites as these really nasty things that try to kill another animal or whatever it is they're living in. But in fact, the parasite's goal is to use that host animal as a survival tool and use it in such a way that they don't kill the animal, because then the parasite wouldn't be able to survive themselves. So we can have parasites both outside and inside the animal, okay? Ecto means out or outer. So ectoparasites are those that live on the animal or outside the animal. These are the ones that you see most often. So things like ticks, lice, fleas, flies are examples of ectoparasites. And maybe you have experienced one of these nasty critters from hiking in the woods. So those are ectoparasites. But the focus of today's talk is going to be endoparasites. Endo means within. So parasites that live inside the animal. And a lot of you said in the chat box there, things like roundworms or tapeworms or just worms in general. And that's exactly right. Those are examples of endoparasites. So what you're seeing here, these are tapeworms inside a horse's colon. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. And the ones that you are seeing here are kind of going to be the highlight of our talk today. These are called strongyle type parasites, and we'll dive into those a little bit deeper. The trick about endoparasites, or these parasites living inside the animal, is that not only do they live in one spot inside the animal, but you have to remember they have to get to that spot. So they travel all over the animal's body, doing damage in all of those organs in order for that parasite to mature and grow, to reproduce and make more baby parasites, and to eat. And they might eat from the host directly, or they might steal nutrients from the host. So what I'm showing you here is a parasite specific to the horse called ascarids. And you can see just the number of them clogging this intestinal tract. And what they do is, this is just a very rough sketch, is they travel around the horse. They hit the lungs, they hit the liver before ending up back in the small intestine. And so some very sensitive organs there, doing some pretty serious damage. So with all of that traveling around and digging through the tissues inside the animal, they can cause things like blood loss. They can steal the nutrition from the host and cause things like stunted growth or weight loss. We can see disease in the airways, in the lungs, and in the nose. We might see some organ damage as well. Okay, and I'll show you this picture again in a little bit and really talk about what's going on here. So any questions so far about what a parasite is? Does anyone have any questions before we move on to those of horses? Okay, so I'm going to keep on moving. So I want to point out that the focus of today's lecture is about parasites inside, right, those endoparasites, adult horses. Okay, and I'm emphasizing that because the parasites inside young horses or foals is very different. It's a whole other ballgame. So we're just going to focus on adult horses, which is what I'm assuming most of you have or work with. So this little chart is wonderful. I'm going to click on this link here so I can zoom in so you can actually kind of see what it is. And I can share this link with you at the end of our talk. It's a really great summary of all of the parasites that you might find inside a horse. Okay, and so you can see there's a lot of them. Some you've probably heard of before, maybe botflies, or maybe you've heard of tapeworms, or you've heard of pinworms. Okay, so there's several that you can see here, but I'm going to go ahead and just tell you now, break the news to you. In our adult horses, there's really only 2 of these that we really have to worry about that require year-round deworming. And those are the small red worm or small strongyle and the large red worm or large strongyle. All these other ones, while we do see them in horses and they can have their own issues, they're less common or they don't really cause disease. So that's why we don't focus our primary deworming around them. I'll be happy to answer any questions about these other parasites at the end of the talk, but I'm really going to focus on the big 2, okay, our strongyles, small and large. So these parasites that are of primary concern for horses are in their intestinal tract. So the intestinal tract of horses, as you probably know, is a little bit tricky, right? Horses are really sensitive to things, sensitive to what we feed them, sensitive to things like colic. And so it makes sense that, of course, the parasites we're worried about are in their stomach, in their bellies. Now, when I say stomach and bellies, I don't mean literally their single stomach organ, but what you probably think of as their stomach is this whole area right here that I'm tracing my cursor around. But what we're really concerned about is the parasites in the adult horse in their cecum, which is this organ right here that I'm tracing, and then their colon. These are the two pieces of their large intestine, which is their last big digestive tract tube before it comes out as manure, okay? So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So in our adult horse, right, tapeworms are important. Large and small strongyles are important. In foals, you maybe have heard of a worm called Parascaris or the equine roundworm or the equine ascarid. I wanted to just put these here just for the sake of you all knowing their names and knowing that they exist. But again, we're really going to zoom in now on these two in red, the large and small strongyles. So you might be wondering, okay, I know parasites are a thing. I know I have to deworm my horse, but how on earth does my horse get these parasites? Does anybody have any idea? These parasites that live in their gut, how does a horse get them? Shoot it in the chat box. Give me an idea. So Steve says from the grass. Okay, what else? The grass is not wrong. Okay, hay, eating something bad, the ground. Okay, so we're on the right track here. We're on the right track, yes. Okay, so in all of my time as a graduate student, I learned two things. Okay, I learned more than two things, but I'm going to tell you the two big things that I learned that you already know. You're not even in grad school yet. Horses are really good at eating and pooping, right? What do they do together all the time? They eat where they poop and they poop where they eat, right? Okay, this is how your horse gets parasites. They poop where they eat and they eat where they poop, and they're really good at doing that, and they don't seem to care a whole lot, okay? So remember, these parasites live in their digestive tract, okay? The digestive tract takes food in, and it goes through, digests it, and then poops it out. So those parasites inevitably are being spread between animals, being contracted. Horses are getting them by eating near their poop, eating off the ground, the grass, okay? So what this picture is showing you is called a life cycle, which you've probably heard that term before. Life cycle is how a living thing is born, lives, and dies, okay? So what we have here is the basic life cycle of these strongyle type parasites that I've been talking about so much. So we know, to follow my cursor here, that the adult worms live inside the horse, in their gut, in their cecum and large intestine. And those adult worms reproduce, okay? They make baby worms, and those baby worms, those eggs is what they are, the eggs, are passed through the horse's feces. So we say properly, what we say is they are shed in manure. All that means is the horse is pooping out the parasite eggs. Okay, so now you have parasite egg poop in your pasture. All right, and what happens outside? When it's wet, it's warm, those eggs hatch. And what hatches out, so now we're here on the pasture, what is hatching out of those eggs are these teeny tiny microscopic larvae, okay? So there's all kinds, millions and millions and millions of teeny tiny critters on the grass, and included in those little critters are these parasite larvae. Now don't worry, you cannot get these parasites from your horse, right? But then those little larvae on the grass start to grow a little bit, and once they get to a certain stage of development, the horse accidentally eats them because they poop where they eat and they eat where they poop, right? So they eat this parasite larva, and then that larva does what it does best. That baby parasite travels all over the horse. Depending on the type of parasite it is, it'll go to different organs, and then they end up back in the intestinal tract and they start the whole process over again, okay? This whole concept is very important when it comes to understanding how to control their parasites, okay? Whose horse would be super thrilled about just being in a stall all the time and not eating any grass, right? Nobody's, right? So we know that that's not necessarily a feasible option, an economic option to just put all the horses inside and never let them eat grass anymore. Okay, so let's talk about what we can do. So the first parasite I want to introduce you to is the large strongyle. Okay, this is one of the two that we're going to focus on today, the large strongyle. That large strongyle, his name is Strongylus vulgaris. Okay, that's how you pronounce that, Strongylus vulgaris, but a lot of people just call it the large strongyle, the large bloodworm, okay? This is it right here. And when I say large, you might be thinking like this big, right? No, okay, like large is like 2 inches, okay? So really not all that big, but compared to some of its buddies, it is big. Now here's the damage, okay? And I told you I was going to show you this picture again. Here's where we're going to talk about it. This little teeny tiny 2-inch worm that lives in the intestinal tract of your horse can do some serious damage. Interestingly, it's not the adult stage that does the damage, okay? Remember when I said, I'm going to back up here, it's all the migrating that little baby parasite does in the horse's organs that cause the damage, okay? And it hits different areas inside before they actually grow up to the adult parasites. That's where this is really important. So the larva migrating in the horse's body most of the time will cause tissue damage, and that tissue damage leads to blood clots, okay? So if you've ever had a scab, right, your blood clots, it stops flowing. That can happen inside the body too, right? Internal bleeding, you want it to stop. But when blood stops from a clot inside, that means blood flow stops to another part of the body. And every part of your body needs blood to continue to live. So if you stop blood flow to your finger, right, your finger is going to die and fall off. If you stop blood flow to part of the horse's intestine, what happens to that intestine? It dies. Right here is where it's what's happening. That black bit, this is a pocket of the horse's intestine right here. This is during surgery. This part of the intestine has lost blood flow due to a blood clot caused way in a different part of the horse. But even way far away, that caused some serious damage. And that intestinal piece died. And then your horse gets colic, and I'm sure you all know what colic is. It's a very painful tummy ache, essentially, for the horse, and it can kill them. So what we're looking at here, this, I know just looks like a big blob of mess, but if you follow my cursor here, this area is an artery, which is a big blood vessel, okay? And this big blood vessel in particular lies right along the spine. So you can imagine a big blood vessel that lies right next to the spine is very important, and it is, okay? This should look nice and neat. It should look clean. It should look white and clear. It should not have all of this red puffy stuff. That's the disease. And you can see, if you follow my cursor, the little worms of Strongylus vulgaris right here, they get in there and they kind of swim around and they dig into all of that tissue and they cause a whole bunch of damage, and that tissue gets angry and it starts to swell up and you get blood clots and you get edema and just a bunch of damage, and then the blood can't flow anymore. So that's what this parasite is doing. If we talk about small strongyles, it's a little bit of a different story. They're commonly referred to as small strongyles. Sometimes you will hear them referred to as cyathostomas, okay? Now remember, I said large strongyles, they're not really large. Okay? They're like 1.5 inches, 2 inches maybe. So how big do you think the small strongyles are? Okay, they're like, boop, just a couple millimeters, maybe a centimeter, okay? You're thinking, well, my goodness, how can something this tiny cause a problem in such a big 1,200-pound animal? Well, they do. Okay, and these are actually kind of the root of the problem and what we really want to get when you're deworming a horse. So they're the most common. We see them all over the place. If you have a horse, it has these parasites. So what they do, these little critters, they don't go all over the place in the body. They get eaten by the horse, they go into the intestines, and they burrow into the intestinal wall. Okay, so what you're looking at here is a piece of the horse's intestine, and all these little spots, these little pepper type sprinkles, is where that teeny tiny larva has burrowed itself in. And so all these little peppers are larvae, okay? And this is a close-up image. You can see all these little kind of comma-shaped things. These are all buried or burrowed in, encysted little larvae. So, okay, they've dug themselves in, now what? Well, then they sit and wait. And they can wait for an entire season, an entire year. At some point, we don't know exactly what triggers it, but they will all come out. And so although individually they're really tiny, if you have a bunch of really tiny things shoved into the intestinal wall and then all at one time they burst out, what do you think happens? It just rips open that tissue, right? It causes a whole bunch of damage. And so that can lead to things like diarrhea or colic. Okay, not as deadly as that other parasite we talked about, but it certainly can be problematic. Okay, so by now, this sounds like a horror story, right? Your beloved horse has these parasites. Oh my goodness, it's going to kill them. Should you be worried? Well, hang on, okay? Yes, parasites can be bad. Maybe you should be worried a little bit, okay? But there's always a but. All grazing horses are assumed to have parasites, and this is totally normal. In fact, every grazing animal you drive by, whether it's cattle or whether it's sheep or goats or horses, they've all got parasites. And you drive by, you go through Lexington, Kentucky, and you take the bluegrass scenic route, and you're like, oh, they're all so beautiful. They are. And they also all have parasites, okay? Most healthy adult horses do not show any clinical signs of having parasites. In fact, by looking at these horses right here in this picture, they're all fat, happy, shiny, pretty. They all have babies. All these mares have babies. Would you look at them and think, man, I'm worried about their parasites? Would anyone think that? I got a little secret for you. This particular herd of horses is from the University of Kentucky. I studied them a lot during my graduate school. They have never been dewormed since 1972. Now, granted, these are not the same horses from 1972. Those would be like 50-year-old horses, but generations and generations of horses maintained in this herd have never been dewormed, and they do just fine. Now, it's a really unique herd to study, which is why we have them and why we don't deworm them. So we have this population of horses and parasites to study, but it's proof that we as horse owners over deworm our horses, okay? Because we've got horses right here that do just fine. In this herd since 1972, we have never had a horse colic or die due to anything related to parasites, okay? Now, that being said, that doesn't mean we should just throw out all of our dewormers and never deworm horses again, okay? Because you would not want your one horse to be the exception, right? And then have disease. But I want you to know, we as horse owners, we over deworm, okay? So let's talk about this a little bit. Let's talk about managing these intestinal parasites, specifically those two, the large and small strongyles, the large and small bloodworms in healthy adult horses, Okay, does anyone have any questions so far before we move on to kind of another topic here? Is anyone like surprised? Reese, I see you raised your hand. Go ahead.
So if like the horse gets worms, like when it eats it, wouldn't it already be dead? Or
Would the worms already be dead?
yes, because the horse is like eating it.
That is an excellent question. And no, they are not dead. Parasites are really, really tricky little boogers. And they are so small, they're microscopic, the ones that the horse actually consumes. I mean, you can go out on your pasture and you don't see anything, right? They're there, but they're microscopic. And so they are so tiny that they don't get hit by, the horse's teeth or anything like that. Parasites are incredibly smart and they evade that kind of stuff. But good question.
Okay.
Anyone else? Okay. Yes, you have a question. I don't have your name on there, but go right ahead. I see your hands up.
So that's why the parasites kind of look like little kind of like maggots or something. They're like as small as little maggots.
Yeah, a maggot is kind of a good way to describe them, because a maggot, is like a fly larva. It's a baby fly, right? So these parasites, they always stay a worm, but there is a baby form. Okay, does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Okay, so they don't ever grow up to like be a fly or be anything else. These parasites we're talking about always stay a worm. They just get bigger, small, big.
All right.
Yeah, good question. Anybody else have a question? Okay, so let's talk about managing these worms, these parasites. Okay, so I said earlier, it's really important to remember this basic life cycle when it comes to controlling these worms, right? Because horses eat where they poop where they eat, they inevitably have parasites. But remember, there's a stage of the parasite inside the horse, and there's a stage of the parasite, the baby parasites, outside of the horse on the pasture. So that means we have two ways to control these parasites. We can do it by controlling the ones inside the horse, and we call that a chemical method, which I'll explain. But we can also control the parasites outside of the horse, in the horse's environment, in the pasture, and we call that an environmental method, okay? So environmental control, right? Again, we're looking at the things, the little baby parasites on the pasture. We're focusing on preventing the horse from eating those parasites to begin with. So we want to control how many parasites are on the pasture. So we can do things like pasture management, which is a big word with a lot of different meanings. And I'll give you some examples in a moment. Manure management, that's a never-ending process. What do you do with all the poop that your horse makes? And then something called stocking density. Okay, stocking density means how many horses you have in a field. Okay, so what you want to avoid is this, where you have very little grass and a lot of horse poop because you have too many horses in one area. So what happens here is the horses are forced to basically eat the grass really close to the ground, really close to the poop, and inevitably really close to the parasites, okay? So that's what you want to avoid. So something like this, okay, where you have this giant lush green fields, with very few horses is ideal. Now, that's not always economically feasible. So don't worry if that's not how your horse is. Mine is not like that either. But that's the ideal scenario where you have longer grass, fewer horses, more area for them to poop and not eat where they poop. So some other things you can do is manure management, pasture management. So something like composting the manure, which means you put all the manure in a pile, and over time, as that manure breaks down, it produces heat. Okay, if you've ever been near a compost pile, it's warm. And in the very, very center, it's really warm, and it gets hot enough that it will actually destroy those parasite larvae. So you can put all the poop in one spot and let it do its job. Another thing you can do, it's a very tedious task, is clean up the manure from the pasture. And that is not always feasible because not many people are willing to spend hours out in a paddock with a pitchfork and a muck bucket cleaning it up. There are fancy things that you can tow behind, like a four-wheeler, and like scrape the manure off the ground, but you have to have a relatively level field to do that, and it costs money, and so not always feasible. Okay, so you want to try your best to manage it with the environment, but when that doesn't always work, we can do that chemical control. And again, that's controlling the parasites inside the horse, right? And that's when you use a chemical, a medicine, a dewormer, okay? So you've all probably heard of or done deworming to a horse, and it's something you give them in their mouth. It's like a gel or a paste type of thing that they eat and swallow, and usually they don't really like it a whole lot, but you know, sometimes they're flavored. Now, what you'll notice is sometimes a few days or a week later, you might see parasites in the horse's poop if you look closely. Okay, you see my pointer here and you can see these little worms in the poop. Oh no, is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? So if you dewormed your horse and the parasites came out, what does that mean? Is that good or bad? Give me a shout in the chat box. Good, yeah, good, that's right. Some people get really worried when they see parasites in the poop, but that actually means your horse is kicking them out, okay? So it's a good thing. So no, you cannot get parasites from them being here. Your horse cannot get parasites from these adult worms because remember, they only get infected when they consume the baby worms. So even if your dog or your little brother or your horse or your foal goes and eats this horse poop with these adult worms, you can't get the worms from this, okay? So now my next question for you, now that we know a little bit about dewormers, what is your go-to dewormer? Those of you that have dewormed a horse, how do you know which one to pick? What do you choose when you go to the feed store or Southern States? Who's got a favorite? Yes, go ahead. I see a hand up. Give me a shout in the chat box if you have a favorite. What's it called? What's your favorite product? Or maybe you know what it looks like. What does it look like on the box? Ivermectin, good. What else do we have? Panicure, okay. All right, so there's a lot, right? If you go to the store to buy dewormer for your horse, you're going to be blasted in the face with a ton of brightly colored packages with horses on them and different claims of what they do. So take a minute here, look and see how many dewormers are there. Count them. Tell me how many different ones there are and give it in the chat for me. So y'all are saying 11, okay. All right, our counting skills are right on, but this was a trick question, okay. So what I'm gonna highlight here, what you're seeing right here are different products, okay. These are different brands, but if you look closely in the red box that I've highlighted here, How many different words are there in the red boxes? So I've got a pyrentyl pamoate here. I've got another pyrentyl pamoate down here, an ivermectin here, and ivermectin there. So those are the same, okay? So what I have highlighted in the red boxes is called the active ingredient. That is what actually kills the worms. The Exodus, Bimectin, Quest, Anthelcide, Zymectrin, et cetera, that's just the product name. But when you get down to what actually does the job, there's only 5 different dewormers for horses. Only 5. And I've narrowed it down by these active ingredients. So I just picked arbitrarily. So Safeguard, for example, uses fenbendazole. You can see that word here. And Panacure uses fenbendazole, okay? And then we've got Zymectrin uses ivermectin, and this Horse Health uses ivermectin, okay? So I've just kind of picked one of each and narrowed it down to 5. So there's 5 active ingredients to get our parasites. All right, so keep that in mind. Now, how many of you have seen something that looks kind of like this, where it lists the months of the year and it tells you what to deworm with? Has anyone seen that? Okay, so that's like a deworming calendar, okay? And it tells you every other month, use this type of dewormer to get rid of the parasites. And that goal was used to be recommended. What this was called was rotational deworming. So what you'll notice if you look closely, January, February, you're using pyrentyl pamoate, March, April, fenbendazole, May, June, ivermectin, and then it repeats. So you're switching an active ingredient every other month. And this is still really popular in some areas. It's a very much a traditional method, but it's not recommended anymore. It used to work and it used to be very useful against parasites. But here's the kicker, okay? Many of the parasites infecting horses have developed resistance to dewormers. Resistance means the parasites resist the dewormer. That means the dewormer does not work. So let me break this down a little bit, why this is so important. So here's your horse, okay? We're gonna look at this guy here on the left. And your horse poops where he eats and eats where he poops, right? So he gets parasites. This is my little representation of parasites. And I've just told you that a lot of our parasites are resistant to the dewormer. So my red worms here are those that are not affected by the dewormer. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, what other thing are horses really good at? They're really good at eating and really good at pooping, right? So our parasites lay eggs that come out in the horse's poop. So now we have a whole bunch of parasite eggs here on the pasture. The black eggs and the black worms are ones that will be affected by the dewormer. The red worms and their red eggs, for example, will not be affected by the dewormer. Okay, so this is your horse and his parasites that he has and the things that he poops out. And you, being the good horse owner that you are, decide to deworm him, okay? So what happens if you deworm your horse and he has parasites that will not be affected by that dewormer? The only thing that's left inside your horse are parasites not affected by the dewormer. And so your horse does what he does best. He poops, okay? And those parasites lay eggs, and the eggs come out in the poop, and the eggs get on the pasture. So you might be thinking, well, okay, we got rid of some of the parasites. The black ones aren't there anymore. That's good. Okay, let me ask you this. What would happen if you dewormed him again with the same dewormer? Yes, go ahead. I see your hand up. Go ahead. I don't have your name on my screen, but I see your hand up. Go ahead and shout it out. So you would get more eggs and you wouldn't get any parasites being killed. Okay, that's what's happening. So in most horse herds, okay, any given horse herd, it is assumed worldwide, anywhere in the world, it is assumed that those parasites are resistant to dewormers. Okay, it's just a known fact. It's a rule rather than an exception. So it's a problem because if you remember, we didn't have a whole lot of dewormers actually available. So I want to bring us back to this point that I made a long time ago. The primary parasite of concern is called the small straw giles. And we said even though they're teeny tiny, they're actually a problem because they bury themselves into the intestinal wall and then they burst out. And that makes your horse sick. These parasites are the primary concern when it comes to deworming because they don't get affected by dewormers very well. So these were the dewormers we had left after we removed all of the repeats of the active ingredients. And we said, okay, we have 5. We've got fenbendazole, oxybendazole, moxidectin, ivermectin, and pyrethylpamoate. That's it. That's all that's available for horses. That's all that's approved on the market. So which ones of these 5 are going to work against those pesky small straw giles? 2. Okay, so now we're down to 2 that are assumed to be working against those problematic parasites worldwide. Okay, and again, we're talking in our adult horses and their parasites, all right? So with all of that in mind, okay, with knowing the problems parasites can cause, knowing that your horse is inevitably infected with parasites all the time, and knowing that we're running out of dewormers that work, that means you as the horse owners or future horse owners or horse lovers need to know what it means to deworm responsibly in a proper way. And this is a balancing act, okay? Because you have to balance keeping your beloved horse healthy and happy and keep helping him with his parasite burden, okay? Not letting it get too out of control, but also recognizing that he can do a pretty good job of managing his parasites if he's otherwise healthy. The other side is keeping your dewormer working. Okay, so even though we have those 2 dewormers left, we're finding on horse farms all around the world that they're starting to not work as well. So we have to be careful in how we use them. So I'm going to take just a few minutes. I know we're getting to be out of time here. I've just got a little bit to go about what that means to be responsible when it comes to deworming. So number 1 thing is to recognize that deworming your horse does not mean you are trying to get rid of all of the parasites in him. Okay, because that's impossible. Because we know horses poop where they eat where they poop. And so they're always infected. But your goal with deworming is to control the amount your horse gets infected with. Okay, so this is how you do that. You have to, number 1, use your vet. Okay, you got to talk to your vet. They will help you do this. Your vet will tell you, well, let's do a fecal egg count. Let's collect some poop and look at it. And you're like, that's weird. Why are we going to look at poop? I'll tell you why in a minute. You need to monitor how well that dewormer is working. You need to work with your fellow horse owners and your horse's pasture mates. And then also use those environmental control measures that we talked about a while ago. Keeping the pastures clean, not having too many horses on a pasture at once, etc. So your vet's going to tell you to do a fecal egg count. She's going to say, all right, collect some horse poop, put it in a baggie and stick it in your fridge. You're like, that's weird. A little bit. But what you do, what your vet will do is process this poop in the lab. Okay, and it's a very simple process, but they do it and then they look at it under the microscope. What they look at under the microscope are for those little parasite eggs. And this is what they look like. These are the parasite eggs of those strongyle type parasites. And inevitably, this is what they will see. And then they might find, so Linda, I see your question there, and I will get to that. Don't let me forget, but I'll get to that at the end. And then you might find some other types of parasite eggs that we didn't get to talk about just because of time, but that might warrant a different type of deworming. Okay, but inevitably right here is what they're going to see. So it gives us some information about what's going inside the horse. So we use these fecal egg counts to identify, well, which horses are putting out the most eggs on the pasture. And again, this is talking about those strongyle parasites, okay? So here's your herd of beautiful horses, okay? They're all culprits of pooping where they eat, eat where they poop, and putting eggs on the pasture. They all have parasites. So here's my representation of parasites. Some of them have more parasites than others. It's just how it is. They all poop, and all these parasites shed eggs. And what you'll notice by my picture here is a very simplified version. But this little guy on the right, this little chestnut that has the most parasites out of all of them, is shedding very few eggs. This little gray isn't shedding any eggs at all. So this horse with medium amount of parasites is shedding the most eggs. So this is where it gets really tricky. The amount of eggs that a horse is shedding in their poop has nothing to do with the number of parasites infecting them. I know it annoys me too. It drives me nuts that it does not match, but that's just the way it is. That's just biology. So you have to decide, well, who really needs to be treated? If my little chestnut over here is happy and healthy and fat and shiny and looks really great and not putting out a whole lot of stuff on the pasture, a whole lot of eggs, maybe I need to save the dewormer for the horse that is putting out and infecting all his other pasture mates, okay? So this is where it requires that coordination with all the horses or owners on that farm, because you have to work together to use your dewormers responsibly. Instead of deworming everybody all the time and losing a effective dewormer, you got to pick who's doing the most damage on the pasture, who do we need to deworm to help with that. So sorry, I'm repeating my slide here. Okay, so in this scenario, if this was my herd of horses, I would deworm this guy right here and maybe this one, okay? And then I would maybe wait, not never deworm, but wait to deworm these two. If they're happy and healthy and they're not showing anything clinically, I would probably maybe pass on them for one time. It's not that you never want to deworm them, you're just trying to be conservative. So in summary, okay, with everything that we have kind of gone over, a responsible deworming program will use your vet and you let them do fecal egg counts so that you can pick which dewormers are, or excuse me, which horses you should deworm. And then talk to your vet about which dewormers to use. Okay, because depending on what they find on that fecal egg count, they may need to use something to get a different parasite that your horse might have. The rule of thumb put out by the American Equine Practitioners Association is that all horses should be dewormed twice per year, and that's to help them all manage their parasites. But everybody else that maybe needs an extra deworming, they should be identified by if they are putting out a lot of eggs on the pasture, if maybe they're clinically ill from parasites. That can happen. Rarely, but it can. Or if maybe you've got a rescue horse that you've taken and you have no idea when it was dewormed last, go ahead and deworm it just to make sure it is getting rid of parasites as it needs to. And then again, coordinate with your herd mates, and your vet can help you do that as well. So with that, does anyone have any questions? Linda, I can also